And welcome to our webinar, Voting Through a Pandemic in the 2020 Presidential Election. The Future of California Elections is a nonprofit, nonpartisan network of election stakeholders made up of election officials, reform advocates, and civil rights and civic engagement groups from across the state. Our mission is to modernize elections and expand participation by developing shared strategies for elections administration and to ensure our election system serves all of California's electorate, including underrepresented voters, voters with disabilities, and limited English proficient voters. Now, you may have already visited our website to register for today's events. I encourage you to take a look at the resources available for all to help in aiding your communities vote in this year's election. We also ask that you fill out a short survey at the end of the webinar to tell us what tools and resources you need so that we can show our future events meets those needs. Our panelists today are an excellent example of the broad perspectives that form our network, and we're fortunate to have them presenting information that can help ensure a safe and successful election day in November. They are, in order of presentation, Rosalind Gold, the Chief Public Policy Officer for Naleo Education Fund, Gail Pellerin, the County Clerk and Registrar of Voters for Santa Cruz County, and James Woodson, Senior Policy Manager of California Calls. Please feel free to add questions for our panelists in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen that you may have as the webinar progresses. We'll bring all three together to address those questions after the final presentation. Our first presenter, Rosalind Gold, has worked for over 3 decades on policy analysis and research for Naleo's Latino civic engagement efforts and has extensive policy expertise in the areas of newcomer civic integration, election reform, voting rights, redistricting, and the census. She also coordinates research for several of the fund's publications and serves on the board of the directors of the National Institute on Money and State Politics and as chair of the Future California Elections Board of Directors. Please welcome Rosalind Gold.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I want to start by thanking all of you who have joined this webinar. We are going to have a really exciting discussion about a very, very pressing issue that's facing our state, which is how do we conduct our elections with an unprecedented public health, social, and economic environment. In my presentation, and I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint here, hang in there. There we go. In my presentation, I'm going to start by talking about just kind of the policy landscape of the pandemic and how the issue of having elections where everybody primarily votes by mail surfaced initially. And I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why California really needs to have a full range of options for voting to make sure that our elections are safe and fair and accessible for everybody. I'm then going to talk about what I call the zigzag or the seesaw or the roller coaster of policy developments between executive orders from the governor, between the dialogue between many stakeholders that the Secretary of State managed, and also what's going on legislatively on these issues. And finally, I'm going to leave folks with some issues to think about as we move forward to implement these policies. So as, sorry, I'm trying to get this to move here. Just a second. There we go, needed a little push. As I mentioned, you know, when our nation and our states were faced with the idea of how do we vote safely in a pandemic, many policymakers and some advocates and election officials as well said, hey, the solution to this is for everybody to vote by mail or drop mail ballots off at their polling sites, that we just can't do in-person voting safely. Well, many of us knew from our work with our communities and stakeholders that we really needed to make sure Californians had a full range of voting options because of the diversity of how people cast ballots in our state. For example, research has shown that in California, The use of vote by mail by Latinos and other underrepresented groups is really less than that of the overall population. There's some great research from Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Los Angeles, that showed that VBM ballots submitted by Asian Americans and voters not fully proficient in English also were rejected at a higher rate than ballots submitted by the overall population. And so what are some of the reasons that we know contribute to low vote by mail usage or failure of these ballots to count? Well, first of all, many voters in underrepresented communities don't know about the practices and the procedures on how to obtain or complete vote by mail materials. Also, in many underrepresented communities, there's just bad mail service. Ballots don't arrive in the mail. People don't trust that if they send a ballot back in the mail, it's going to get there. Moreover, for people who need language assistance during voting, the ability to cast a ballot at an in-person location allows people to get customized in-language assistance and in-language materials to cast their ballot. Sometimes in our communities, and this is going to be even more so the case because people are locating and relocating because of the pandemic, the voter files don't have correct information, so the ballots don't get to the place they're supposed to. And then there's been some qualitative research that shows Latinos and some other community members feel that if they vote in person, they'll have a chance to represent their community or model good civic behavior for their families. So this is kind of the landscape of the dialogue that started. And if we start to look at really sort of the kickoff, on March 4th, Governor Newsom declared the COVID-19 pandemic state of emergency in the state. And from mid to late March, the Secretary of State led a very intense and very engaged discussion with a wide group of stakeholders. It included county election officials, legislative staffs, advocates, civic organizations, community groups, and we all got together and really tried to think through all of the issues facing us about the pandemic and voting. And by the way, California was one of the earliest states, if the earliest, to actually start coordinated planning. As stakeholders, there are several key issues we talked about. First of all, how do we make sure that everybody gets a vote by mail ballot? Because we did recognize the value of ensuring that everybody gets a vote by mail ballot, but also at the same time, how do we provide safe in-person voting? Gail, my colleague, will be talking a bit more about this in her presentation, but there's all sorts of questions about election infrastructure. What kind of equipment do you use? What kind of technology do you need if you're going to have a lot more vote by mail ballots? If you're having trouble locating poll workers or finding voting locations in light of the pandemic, how do you deal with all those infrastructure issues? We also talked about how do we ensure that voting is linguistically accessible and accessible for voters with disabilities. And then, my colleague James is going to be talking a lot more about this, which is how do we make sure we do effective voter education and outreach? Okay. Well, the initial executive order that was issued on elections, one of the earliest, came out on March 20th, which permitted certain special elections in the state to be conducted as what was called an all-mail ballot election. In other words, everybody would get a ballot in the mail. Now, it was very also clear from the start that this did not preclude providing in-person voting opportunities. That was actually in the order. So this concept in California of the need to preserve in-person opportunities was right on the top of policymakers' minds for the very start. The initial order also realized that officials who were trying to complete the canvassing, the official count of the March 3rd primary, because of issues with staffing or technology or just generally having to, deal with issues because of the pandemic, needed to extend their deadlines for completing the official canvass of the primary beyond the number of days, and so it was extended to 21 days. The big executive order that came out, though, was the one on May 8th, which required all county election officials to send vote-by-mail ballots to every registered voter in the state for the November 3rd election. The executive order again referred to the need for California to retain in-person voting opportunities. It indicated that the governor would issue further direction by May 30th. And, as I said, California is the first state in the nation to have issued such an order, providing everybody vote-by-mail ballots for the election. So the next place where action started to occur, or basically simultaneously, was in the state legislature. And AB 860 is a bill that requires, again, all county election officials to mail a ballot to all registered voters for the November 20th general election. And by the way, when I talk about these executive orders, or I talk about this legislation, I'm going to do it in a very high level, general way. So I know we've got a lot of really smart expert people out there, and if I miss nuances or anything needs clarifying, just let me know. But this is like a general summary of a lot of the orders and the executive actions. So anyway, AB 860 also provided voters with an option to use a type of voting that is more accessible to persons with disability, called certified remote accessible vote by mail. It also required counties to implement a ballot tracking system so that people who submitted vote by mail ballots would be able to track and find out where they were in the system. It also recognized that, hey, there may be issues with mail delivery, so that if your vote by mail ballot would be received by the 17th day after election day, it would be considered received. It extended the period that the vote by mail ballot could get there. It also allowed the counties to begin earlier processing, not counting, but processing of the ballots. And again, it explicitly stated that nothing in the law prevents in-person voting. And the governor signed this bill into law on June 18th. Excuse me. Okay, so again, we zigzag back to the governor. On June 3rd, he issued an executive order. And this is when there was a real drill down on in-person voting requirements and what you might want to call minimum level of in-person voting requirements would be required. And to understand this, I think it's important to know about the difference between what we call Voters' Choice Act counties and non-Voters' Choice Act counties, okay? California allows certain counties that meet certain requirements to hold elections by, instead of having local precinct or a local voting location, throughout the county, that basically people can vote at vote centers. And there are some advantages of being a VCA county in terms of the vote centers. Vote centers have to typically be open and provide for early voting 10 days in advance. There's a variety of things you can do at vote centers that you might not be able to do at a local precinct. And vote centers, you can vote at any vote center in the county, no matter where you live. Whereas if you have to vote at your local precinct, there are certain geographic sites you have to go to, certain precinct sites you have to go to. So let's talk about the counties that don't have Voter Choice Act. Basically, the June executive order says, if you want, you need to meet certain minimum in-person voting requirements. You have to make one polling place available per 10,000 registered voters. Those polling places have to be opened what we call E3, which is the weekend and Monday before Election Day, with longer hours of being open required for Election Day itself, and the county has to meet specific ballot drop-off location requirements, certain requirements to how many places people can also drop their ballots out. For the VCA counties, remember I had said that typically VCA counties, for many of their vote centers, would have to have them open 10 days beforehand. It basically says under the executive order that it's okay if they're open 3 days before Election Day. And there are some less stringent requirements with respect to the plan that the county has to formulate and get public comment on. That's the June executive order. So where are we in the legislature? Well, right now, SB 423, which also sets forth in-person voting requirements for non-VCA and VCA counties, is pending in the Assembly. It's very similar in terms of VCA counties, in terms of cutting back on the number of days that vote centers are required to be open. For non-VCA counties, it's somewhat similar to the executive order because it generally permits counties to meet minimum in-person voting requirements, if they make one consolidated polling location available for every 10,000 registered voters. And if those locations are opened, again, E3 days before election day. It also specifically says there has to be at least 2 ballot drop-off locations in every county, or 1 for every 15,000 voters. It also goes into more detail about how those locations, for those voting locations, must be distributed. They have to be equitably distributed across counties, and they have to be geographically accessible and accessible to voters with disabilities. Other requirements are there has to be posting and comment, an opportunity for comment on polling and ballot drop-off locations. The Secretary of State and counties have to conduct voter education and outreach campaigns. Counties can seek a waiver of some of these requirements under certain circumstances. And one of the provisions, and maybe Gail can explain this, but this bill actually says you're allowed to establish a polling place or vote center in a location whose primary purpose is the sale and dispensation of alcoholic beverages. Now, as we speak, we're expecting this bill to hit the Assembly floor tomorrow for an Assembly vote. So here's some outstanding issues that we're still thinking about and dealing with as we move forward to implement. First of all, we're not sure there's going to be sufficient resources, basically funding for state and localities to conduct the kind of really comprehensive voter education and outreach that is needed. We're also concerned that voters who choose to vote or need to vote in a language other than English are not going to get the information they need, and specifically a mailer that allows them to say, hey, yeah, here's how I want to vote. These are the in-language materials I want to get. This waiver process that I talked about, we're going to be watching to see how that's implemented. And then in general, how do we make sure public and stakeholders and voters actually can share their input, share their perspectives on how counties are doing as they move forward? I just wanted to leave you with our note that we operate a free bilingual hotline, a toll-free bilingual hotline, 1-888-VEI-VOTA. It's an election information hotline during the year and turns into an election protection hotline during election time. And I think I'm going to stop there, but I just want to thank you all again. And I also want to do a special shout out to the Future of California election staff, Astrid, Katie, and Lupe for all of their work in putting this webinar together. Thank you so much. And I'll take questions at the end.
Thank you, Rosalind. We always appreciate your shout outs and the information you provided today. So our next presenter is Gail Bellerin, the County Clerk Registrar of Voters for Santa Cruz County. She was appointed to the position in July 2004 after serving as the county's election manager since 1993 and was elected for a 4th term in 2018. She has more than 33 years of experience in public service, 7 years working for the state legislature in Sacramento, and 26 years serving as the primary elections official in Santa Cruz County. Gail served as the president of the California Association of Clerks and Election Officials from 2010 to 2012, has served on the Secretary of State's Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee since 2006, and has been a member of the Future of California election since 2011. Please welcome Gail Bellerin.
Okay. Can everybody see that? All right, everybody see that? Yes?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, good. Sorry. Anyway, well, thank you for that. And thank you, Rosalind. I'm very honored to be part of this panel today. And I'll be going through several slides here. And I understand all this PowerPoints will be posted on the FOS website. So, okay, why is it not going? Here we go. So a ballot will be mailed to all voters for the November election. And it's crazy to me how many people have not heard that message yet. So we really need to do a good job of putting that out there. There will also be in-person voting options. And the way I look at it, there's going to be 4 different voting models that counties can enlist. One of them would be a traditional, whoops, what happened? We still have that?
No, your PowerPoint came down.
Okay, sorry. I keep getting some weird screen here. Okay, all right, let's go this way. Okay, so one of those would be a traditional polling site where voters are assigned to a location, the same number of locations as they would have in March. Basically, it's 1 per 1,000 voters, and they'd be open Tuesday only. Then we're going into a model where voting locations would be 1 per 10,000 voters, and voters would be assigned to a specific location. And they would be open a minimum of 4 days, Saturday, Halloween, through Tuesday, November 3rd, Election Day. And ballots there would be specific to voters assigned to that location. A third model is the one that we're doing in Santa Cruz County, where voting locations are 1 per 10,000 voters. Voters can go to any location. Voters must have, the locations must have connectivity to the voter database so we can print ballots on demand. And again, we're open a minimum of 4 days, the 31st through Election Day. And then you've got your Voters' Choice Act counties. There's 15 counties that are in that category, and it's not as strict as the model they had to do in March, but again, voters can go to any location. Locations have connectivity to our state voter registration database, VOCAL, and again, on-demand ballot printing, so any voter can go anywhere, and open a minimum of 4 days, the 31st through the 3rd. And so we are in Santa Cruz County, we're really trying to avoid the words vote by mail. We're really talking about mailing ballots to voters so they can vote safely from home. And we are going to be mailing our ballots on October 5th, but some counties will be mailing them before October 5th. So we were looking at what's needed for in-person voting, and I'm kind of looking at those vote center models, whether mine, Vote Center Light, or like the other 15 counties, but equipment is big. You've got to have ballot on demand systems. You have to have laptops. You have to have secured connectivity. And we have to have at least 3 accessible voting units. We're going to have more than that per location. And then we're looking at locations. And as much as I would love to put all my voting locations in a bar, they're not large enough, I don't think. So we do need to have something that's large enough. So we're looking a lot more toward high school gymnasiums now, enough so we can provide for physical distancing, ample parking, make sure it's accessible, and is it available for the 4 days plus the day before and after for supply drop off and pickup. People, we need people well-trained, a workforce to work, normally people work just 1 day. Now we're having them work 4 days, and that's included in a weekend. And we're gonna have to bump those numbers up for Tuesday because I suspect people will wait to the last minute and do it then. And then we had PPE, the masks and face guards, hand sanitizer, disinfectant, sneeze guards, gloves. We're all trying to coordinate purchases of that. I believe Secretary of State is working closely with us on that one. But then we're also looking at additional supplies. If we're gonna have lines, we need to have chairs for people. I know Neil in Orange County, when they conducted elections under COVID, there were lines at the polls and many people were elderly, and we need to have a place for them to sit safely and not have to stand in line. And then I'm thinking tables for different stations. You want to have a station for just getting a second ballot, same day registration, voter assistance, and lots of signage. We're also looking at mobile voting, and I know some counties do this, and we're really excited that we will be purchasing a mobile voting trailer. And we also are starting to talk to vendors to do pop-up voting in parking lots if needed. For that, we need to have tents and generators. And we're having to be prepared for the event that perhaps a facility that is one of our voting locations for some reason is shut down for whatever reason. I mean, we've got one location that was targeted to be a hospital. I don't know how things are going to look in October, November, but we have to be prepared. So we're looking at possibly having to move to parking lots if needed. So we're trying to flatten that voting curve, and this takes you through basically a a look at where voters were voting in March, very, very low, and then boom, election day. So we really need to work on flattening that voting curve. Okay, why does this not advance? There we go. Recruiting and training election workers. We need people who are not in the vulnerable population, bilingual, available to work more than one day. And we're looking at how we're going to train them. So we're doing an online training program, and we need to do some hands-on training for the voting equipment. We're looking at doing how-to videos, and all of our manuals have to be rewritten. And then we're looking at doing a hotline for our election workers. Our numbers right now of how many people we need is that, but these people that we need all have to be really highly trained. So the 250 people we'll have out at our voter service centers, our voting locations, have to be really highly trained on what they're doing and know election laws. We're going to have 2-person teams to clear drop boxes. We're going to have our staff voter hotline, and then we have election night returns. So we're going to have a lot of need for highly trained people. So we're actually looking at doing 2 hotlines. We'll have one for our election workers, and we normally staff that with full-time extra help and former county staff. But there's a picture of what we did in March, and we are having way too much fun, first of all, and we're way too close together. So yes, we can still use that room, but I could really only put maybe 6 people in there physically distant. So we're desperately looking at how to do this. For our voter hotline, some counties are looking at hiring a service or in-house. We are looking at doing it in-house. You need to have the physical space and people need to have a phone and a computer and access to the election information management system. They need to be trained on election laws and know the local voting program and multiple languages. And in our case, we're looking at having to purchase person-specific phone licenses for each hotline staff person. We need to expand our capacity of our term services for our access to our election management system. And how do we manage people when they're not at one location? And what we normally do is transfer calls. So if someone needs a Spanish assistant, we could just transfer that call to that person next door to us. But now we're gonna have to go find them in other floors and have to figure out how we're doing that. So what's great is the Where's My Ballot, the online tool where you can sign up to find out what's happening with your ballot and where it is. And all counties are going to use that or some similar program, as well as intelligent mail barcodes. We've got the icon on our envelopes. I also put a big X and an O because every voter is going to get a hug and a kiss from our department. Also expanded remote accessible vote by mail ballots. So it's not just for voters with disabilities and military and overseas for November. We're expanding that. Any voter can use it. And we are looking at ways to make sure that voters are aware of this. It does take an extra step for them where they do need to actually print that ballot and put it in their own envelope if they don't have an envelope from me. And if they use their own envelope, they need to put postage on it. And in some cases, we have to sign the outside of the envelope, so they might need to put it in a second envelope so their signature is not out there. Ballot drop boxes, 1 per 15,000, at least 2 boxes in every county, or the same number provided in March. And we have to have those boxes out and available by 9 a.m. on E-28. And they have to, and all of ours are outdoors for drop-off boxes. So I know some counties have them indoors, so they have to make sure those are all available, at least 1 for 12 hours a day. Our county public health officer, we talked to her about how do we do an election in a COVID environment. She says it's hard to get COVID from an inanimate object. The biggest risk, and I thought this was interesting, is defined as within 6 feet for more than 10 minutes, regardless of face coverings. And then the other stuff here, we've all heard, wash your hands, stay home if you're sick, cover your sneezes. And everyone, she's encouraging people to do as much voter outreach in outdoor public settings where you could stand more than 6 feet away. Our voter outreach efforts include, we're working with assisted living facilities, hospitals. We have a program with our jail and inmate facilities, but none of this is business as usual. Everything has changed and different. College students, where are they? We need to let them know their options. We got high school voter education weeks. They're out of session. Voters with disabilities, voters who speak other languages. We've come up with this kind of 3 easy steps to be an informed voter: sign up, check up, track up. I'm going fast because I've got a minute remaining. And how to promote the vote: social media, trusted membership, messengers, precinct captains. We're working on YouTube videos. I'm starting Zoom town halls next week. The Secretary of State has Honor Veterans Vote, Democracy at Work. We're like, voting is everyone's business. Partnerships, all of you. We need everybody talking about this election. You are a superhero. There is a power in our vote. So we need all of you who are, interested in elections to be putting information out in your social media, come up with creative hashtags, talk to people everywhere, and collaboration and consistent messaging is going to be vital. And then poll workers need to know that their vote will count. So the postmark plus 17, the AB 860 Bourbon bill, awesome. That is a #1 reason why ballots don't count. And then the signatures need to compare to the signature on file. There's a way to cure that signature if it's missing or doesn't compare. And then no one can solicit a vote by mail voter or do any electioneering while you're in a residence when someone's voting. And we're going to make sure our campaigns know about that. Like fine wine, ballot counting takes time. So we need to educate campaigns, media, everybody in the world that results will not be final until all votes are tallied. Close contests may not be clear for a week. We have to certify the presidential race by December 1st. So we'll be working toward that. History has shown I count more ballots after election night than on election night. We love big margins, and hopefully that will be the case. But nothing is final till everything's counted, audited, and verified. And then how do we pay for it all? So we have a lot of things we're doing differently and a lot of money at stake. So we are excited about money coming in through the legislation that Newsom signed. And there is a portion for us to do all the increased cost of vote by mail and the voting requirements and staffing and the cleaning PPE, and then a portion for outreach and communication. Congress will likely pass another stimulus package. We hope there's more money there. And then in case of emergency, oh my gosh, there's a lot of things that are outstanding. So counties need flexibility. The only thing permanent in life is change, and we're gonna see changes happening daily. If facilities are shut down, become hospitals, have a COVID outbreak, what is our plan for the backup? What if people get COVID? If I've got full-time staff, election workers, if my ballot counting guru gets COVID, we're a small county, so we're really looking at what happens if these people aren't available. And then you all heard about the issues with the post office. What if there's issues about mailing? And then trusted online sources to get information. People need to be directed to the Secretary of State and county elections to get the latest, greatest information. And then of course, my desire to be well informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. And that is my contact info if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Appreciate that. Just a reminder, you can post questions for our panelists in the Q&A. And these materials, a recording of this webinar, as well as the PowerPoint slides, will be available soon on our website on the same page where the event registration took place.
Do you want us to answer these questions online here, or do we wait till the end?
We'll wait till the end, Gail.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, thanks. And our next presenter is James Woodson. He manages California Calls to work around the 2020 census, redistricting, and the Voters' Choice Act. He is a member of the California Secretary of State's VCA Task Force, as well as the Voters' Choice Los Angeles Steering Committee, and is on the leadership team of the Black Census and Redistricting Hub. Please welcome James Woodson.
Thank you so much, Lupe. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to Rosalind and Gail for those great presentations. My name is James Woodson, Senior Policy Manager at California Calls. What I really wanted to talk about, and Ashley, you can go to the next slide, is really focus on the remaining challenges that we face. So, Rosalind talked about some of the executive and legislative action that we've seen. Gail certainly has lifted the work that the election officials are doing, and particularly her work. But want to talk about from sort of a outreach and education standpoint, the remaining challenges and some of the solutions that we have been working on. But before that, I wanted to say a quick note about California Calls in case folks don't know who we are. And Ashley, you can go to the next slide. So we're a grassroots organization of 31 community-based organizations from across the state. our goal is really to expand the electorate so that it better reflects California's diversity. And so we do integrated voter engagement, contacting 500,000 voters every year, along with our Million Voters Project partners like ACE, CHILA, the Orange County Civic Engagement Table, PICO California, Power California, really aiming to talk to a million voters this year. And you can see on the screen the sort of categories of voters that we talk to, largely new and infrequent voters, young people, communities of color, poor and working class neighborhoods, again, multiple times every year. Next slide, please. You know, Rosalind really talked about this already, so I won't go deep into this, but you know, our main concerns and main push through all of the kind of executive and legislative action was, you know, one, to make sure that we were expanding vote by mail to all registered voters. But again, Rosalind talked about this, but also to make sure that there was in-person locations, as many as possible, to avoid confusion in terms of how people would normally vote, but also to increase physical distancing. And so, you know, we were certainly involved in the executive orders and the legislative action that has happened so far and continue to remain involved. But again, really want to focus today on the remaining challenges. Next slide, please. Which really focus on what we call, what I'm calling the 4 M's. So I think there's you know, challenges in messaging, who the messengers will be, money, which Gail talked about, but I'll go a little bit more in depth about, and then mechanics, and really talking about how CBOs can partner with election officials to make sure election administration happens as robustly as possible. So we'll get into all 4 of these things throughout this presentation. Next slide, please. You know, so to start with messaging, you know, again, we certainly wanted to push for vote by mail expansion to all registered voters. Obviously, you know, knowing that there was the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of times it can be easier for folks, you know, give folks more time to kind of study their ballot. But again, also allow for more physical distancing under the COVID-19 pandemic. But we also knew that vote by mail was not gonna work for a lot of folks. And Rosalind, again, certainly lifted a lot of the points around here. On the screen, you'll see, you know, various reasons why folks may not, you know, be able to vote by mail. You know, some of which are, you know, that they have a disability and just need to be in person. You know, people may not have an address if they're homeless to receive a vote by mail ballot. It's also a presidential election year where we have more new voters who never voted before. There's folks that need language assistance. Again, I know Rosalind lifted up a lot of these points. We also know that there's disparities in communities of color around usage and rejection rates. So, you know, while we were certainly pushing for a range of options in sort of the policy pieces of this, I think this also transfers over to messaging. And next slide, please. And here you'll see kind of things that we think that folks should be thinking about as they are messaging these changes to voters in this election, right? So one is vote by mail conversion and completion to make sure that, you know, that conversion, you know, that folks know how to complete their ballot. We think there needs to be a nuanced approach to that to make sure that again, folks, you know, don't miss the signature line and things like that. There's also returning their ballot, right? That even though you get a ballot in the mail, that doesn't mean that that's the way that you have to return it. You can put it in the mail, but there's also drop box locations that will be available. But then also folks can drop ballots in person and not have to stand in line. And think that that's key, particularly as there, you know, have been reports of issues with the Postal Service and potential underfunding. So if there is mistrust and distrust there, folks should know that they have other options to cast their ballot. And that also includes in-person voting, right? And making sure that we are letting folks know that they're available, they're accessible, and that they're safe. Secretary of State's office has put out health guidelines for how to run in-person voting. We think those need to be lifted up so folks feel comfortable and know that the state is preparing for them to come in person, and they won't unnecessarily be putting their health at risk by showing up at a polling location. We also know that some counties, depending on what model they choose, and Gail talked about the 4 different models, that folks need to know if there's going to be slight changes or fairly substantive changes to the voting model. Next slide, please. Also there needs to be nuanced messaging, just targeting all of these different types of groups. One of the things I wanted to highlight is you'll see there's voters experiencing homelessness here. There's also houseless voters, and distinction there, right, is that there are folks who are just without a home, whether it's an apartment or a mobile home or an actual house. But then there's also folks that are renting, and particularly under COVID-19, who are at a much higher risk of being displaced before November, particularly if we don't have expansion of sort of eviction proceedings and things like that. Where, again, there'll need to be kind of nuanced messaging tactics to make sure we're reaching those folks. There's voters with disabilities, voters with language needs, who all need sort of specialized messaging. And then we also have inactive and unregistered voters, right, who can either, re-register or do same-day registration and vote in this election. So we'll have to hit all of those folks. Next slide, please. And I think one more, yeah. So, one of the things I wanted to lift here around messengers is just the importance of trusted messengers. The point of this slide is to say there's a lot of noise, and not necessarily bad noise, but there's a lot going on right now between the COVID-19 pandemic, between presidential campaigns, racial justice conversations, ballot initiative campaigns are going to start picking up. And so voters will need a way to cut through the noise. And that's where trusted messengers will come in. And that can include elected officials. It can include election officials, but it also needs to include nonprofits and the CBO community. And next slide, please. And we'll get into, why CBOs are well positioned to play that role in a second. But first, I wanted to talk about funding. Next slide, please. And, particularly, you'll see here kind of a breakdown of what we're looking at so far. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the funding that's available for election administration, largely coming from the CARES Act that was passed in, I think, April. And then you'll see at the bottom on the left-hand side, the funding available for really the Secretary of State and counties to do voter education and outreach. And one thing to kind of point out here is that counties aren't getting a lot of funding to do voter outreach, at least from the state. I think it's enough to maybe do one mailer, right? And so there's gaps even there. But on the right-hand side, you'll see some estimates that we've done to reach voters, right? And I think particularly want to point out the 64 to 96 million to reach low and no propensity voters, largely of who, aren't getting, contacted by campaigns, who, usually focus on more likely voters. And so there needs to be some targeted outreach for that. You'll see sort of remaining questions here around federal dollars. Are we going to get additional federal dollars coming in? And then if we do get them, how are we distributing those additional funds? And will they get out to counties and to CBOs in time? I think are open questions. And then there needs to be engagement with philanthropy to help fill any gaps that exist. Next slide, please. And then, again, wanted to talk about how CBOs are well positioned to be trusted messengers in this moment. We know that they're rooted in community. A lot of them are giving services to voters, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and doing mutual aid. And there needs to be that sort of validation of government messages that are coming out through community. Next slide, please. And so, a few recommendations for meeting the moment. We need to continue to advocate for federal funding. There needs to be creative partnerships between state and county officials and the nonprofit community, particularly knowing that we're underfunded when it comes to public education. I think there needs to be a discussion about long-term structural changes to how we invest in elections. I think we all know that there's not a lot of funding for elections generally from year to year. And so we need to be bringing that topic up. And then again, we need to start engaging philanthropy and facilitate dialogue between state and county officials, nonprofits, and philanthropy on filling any sort of needs and gaps. The last thing I'll say, next slide, please. Actually, you can go to the next one. Is there are ways for CBOs to partner with election officials to make sure that some of these things are addressed. One of the things that we heard certainly from election officials is just the challenge of finding voting locations and recruiting poll workers in this moment. CBOs are uniquely positioned to help in this way because, again, they're rooted in community, can identify potential sites that could act as voting locations. They have volunteer bases that they could tap into to recruit poll workers. They also can commit their staff to serve as poll workers. On the left-hand side here, you'll see, Gail mentioned this, the Democracy at Work program through the Secretary of State, where they are looking for this type of help. So we can connect folks if they're interested. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. Just wanted to list, some of the counties that we know are having particular challenges trying to find polling locations. So if you're in those counties or if you know folks in those counties, and really every county, because I think all election officials are dealing with this, please make sure that you reach out to your election official and identify locations that you think would fit best. And with that, I'll hand it back to Lupe.
Thank you, James. Don't go anywhere because we have some questions. We're going to start our Q&A with, and we're going to bring back Rosalind and Gail as well. But James, I know you're limited on time, so I'm going to give you some questions first that came into a Q&A. The first one is about voters. How can voters register to vote without a physical address? And I think the second question that you might be able to address is about the state funding, and is it available to nonprofits?
Gotcha. So on the first piece, really about homeless folks, so they can use an intersection to register to vote, and then they can show up to their kind of local polling location. I know LA County, for instance, does mobile sites that they can also show up to. In VCA counties, you of course can go to any polling location in the county. So there are ways that homeless folks can register and vote. On the state funding, the one slide I showed, I think showed that there was $48 million that's really sort of available for public education, really through the state. 75% of it will be used by the Secretary of State's office to just run their, sort of typical campaign. I think it'll be more robust this time around, being that there's changes. And then the other 25% I mentioned goes to counties, which again really isn't all that much. Although I know we have, counties have their own budgets, which are drastically cut back during this time as well. And I know Gail can attest to that. So the short answer is no. None of that funding in particular is available for CBOs unless counties have it in their budgets to work with CBOs. But that's really why we're looking at some federal dollars and then looking at how we can be creative in setting up some of these partnerships. Some CBOs already have their own funding. And we're planning to do outreach anyway. And so I think there's ways that we can explore partnerships based on that.
Great. And if I could throw that same question at Gail about somebody without a physical address to register to vote, how would you handle that? And are there any plans within your county to actually help CBOs with funding?
Okay, well, for someone who's homeless, we actually do voter outreach to our homeless community. And yeah, so like right now, actually one of my staff was managing a homeless shelter over in Watsonville. We have a homeless shelter out on the benchlands behind the county building now. And so we basically get them registered based on location, yeah, intersection or some physical location, easy enough to do. And it's great when they have a place that we can mail the ballot to them. So we do have a homeless shelter that allows them to get mail there. Sometimes they just come here and pick it up, but that works. And then as far as extra funding, we are losing a position and there's not a lot of extra. We're on furloughs as well. So, you know, it just depends on how everything comes through with the federal and state money and how much we have to do with that amount of money as well. And there's still a lot of things that, you know, things I probably haven't even thought of yet that we need to spend money on. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. And I wanted to, and perhaps this is a question for Rosalind, because you've kind of seen both sides of this particular tug of war between using the phrase vote by mail. And I know this is something that came up in an email discussion we had earlier before this webinar. What have you seen as far as vote by mail? And Gail, I know your own opinion about the phrase. Rosalind, what have you seen about the vote by mail? There was actually a suggestion in Q&A about perhaps vote from home, which seems more user-friendly and addresses some of those concerns. Do you have any insight on that particular phrasing?
You know, actually, I think this just really highlights the fact that whatever phrase we use, we have got to really drill down on educating voters about the full range, because vote from home doesn't necessarily convey that, hey, you couldn't do the ballot at home, but then drop it off at a location. You know, it would be great to do some research into what phrases best resonate with different communities. But bottom line, you know, this issue goes beyond whatever particular phrase we use to describe this act to really the need, as James, you know, I just want to amplify the comments that James made about the need for very detailed voter education about, you know, what you can do with that ballot that comes in the mail and what you should do if you don't get that ballot.
Great, thank you. This is a question for Gail. It's a very direct question. What is the practical difference between voting Model 3 and voting Model 4?
So Model 3 is us. We are not Voters' Choice Out County, so we haven't done all the prep work of meeting with our different community groups and locating our voting locations. And so we haven't done all those studies, but we're going to operate as one. We will not be connecting to VoteCal though. We're just going to be working with our own county election information management system and issuing ballots. Basically, we're taking our office and duplicating it at 16 other locations.
Okay. Great, thank you. This is a question for the entire panel, so if I can get everyone to weigh in on this. Can you discuss the impact of the recent state order that no one be turned away from in-person election sites for a lack of a face covering? How will distancing be accommodated? Can we employ a 6-foot minimum through the in-person voting process while we assist voters as election workers? It's kind of a complex question, but.
So I've actually talked to our county council about this, and we'll be doing more discussion with them and our public health officer. We feel very strongly in Santa Cruz County that if someone shows up without a face mask, they will be asked to go outside. And we will be able to provide them with a ballot outside, but they will not be allowed to go into our facility. And, you know, they're going to have to do everything curbside for the most part.
James, Rosalind, any input on that?
You know, I'll just say really quickly, I think it's a complicated issue. Certainly, you know, think that counties are going to have to figure out how they manage it, right? I think we want to balance not turning folks away and not disenfranchising them with keeping people safe. And, you know, I know Secretary of State has guidelines around that. And then, you know, counties are looking at that. But I think those are the two kind of things that we have to balance. And, you know, Gail has figured out a way to sort of balance those. And so I'll leave it at that.
Great.
And we will have face masks available for voters if they show up without one. And certainly if a voter says due to health reasons, I can't wear one, then we will accommodate and allow him.
Gotcha.
And we won't question further.
Okay, we have hit time. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us and providing all this information. We are having some of you participants should have received an email link to join a networking session immediately after this. Please don't forget to fill out the survey that's in chat. We will leave this webinar live until you can do that. We're going to post the videos and the PowerPoints on our website as soon as possible. The network session, I think, James, you're going to have to leave, but both Gail and Rosalind will join us in that networking session. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Again, thank you to our network partners, our sponsors, the James Irvine Foundation and the Democracy Fund. You can find additional resources on our website, as well as details and registering for future webinars on our events page. We have an event coming up August 11th at 2 p.m. in partnership with the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC. We're also developing plain language, customizable voter education materials, and consolidating election 2020 resources from our network. You can keep track of all this progress by registering updates at our website, and you can find us on social media as well. Final thanks to our presenters. I also want to thank my co-workers, fellow folks, staff members, Executive Director Astrid Ochoa and Project Coordinator Katie Flaherty. We hope to see you at our next event in 2 weeks. Until then, have a good rest of the day and stay safe out there.